Welcome to the sewing room at All My Ways, Andrea, one of my favorite places. My way of living involves doing something DIY or creative every chance I get. And intentional living includes intentional sewing. Sometimes I get a whole lot done, and sometimes I learn a whole lot of lessons. So, I had a simple pattern I thought would serve my purpose if I disregarded particular requirements or considerations. It taught me a few lessons. When sewing with striped fabric, there's a rule that most people learn very early. The stripes are supposed to match across the seams, across the sides, across the front of the garment. Everything lined up neatly and intentionally. But today, I want to show you two dresses made from the same pattern. Only one stripe where that rule didn't quite apply. Both dresses taught me something about fabric, about design decisions, and about the small surprises that sometimes appear when we start experimenting with pattern hacking. And as it turns out, sometimes the fabric has a few ideas of its own. What is pattern hacking? Pattern hacking is about getting more from what you already have. New designs. New here means straying from the original design on the envelope and making something else. Sometimes you'll make mistakes, but there's no reason to fear because you learn from it. Let's begin with the striped dress. The pattern itself is quite simple. It has four main pieces: the bodice front and back and the skirt sections. It's designed as an unlined dress with facings, but in my version, I decided to make it fully lined instead. Now, normally, when you're working with striped fabric, you cut the pieces along the straight grain so that the stripes run horizontally or vertically, and you can match them carefully across the seams. But this time, I decided to cut the dress on the bias. That means placing the pattern pieces at an angle across the fabric so that the grains run diagonally instead of straight. Bias cuts often create beautiful movement and drape in a garment, but there's a trade-off. Cutting on the bias uses more fabric. And in this case, I didn't actually have enough fabric to do two things at once: cut on the bias and carefully match the stripes. So I made a choice. I chose the bias and I accepted that the stripes will not match perfectly. Instead of trying to control them, I allowed the diagonal stripes to become part of the design. Of course, once the dress was assembled, another interesting thing happened. Because the stripes were cut on the bias, they were already running diagonally across the garment. But when I began fitting the dress, I made another adjustment that changed them. I added a center back seam. I often do this because my lower back curves inward more than average, and that seam allows me to shape the garment more precisely to my body. But shaping the seam meant the stripes shifted again. Then the same thing happened at the side seams. Whenever fabric moves around curves, such as the waistline shaping inward and the hips moving outward, the direction of the stripes changes slightly as well. And because these stripes were already diagonal, the left and right sides of the dress didn't behave exactly the same way. The fabric was simply responding to the curves of the garment. This is one of the things that happens when sewing with stripes on the bias. If you want the stripes to match perfectly across seams, each pattern piece usually has to be cut individually and positioned very carefully on the fabric so the lines align. That takes more time, and usually it takes more fabric. In this case, I chose a different approach. The mismatched stripe became part of the character of the dress. And sometimes that's exactly what pattern hacking is about. Taking a familiar pattern and allowing a few new ideas or limitations to lead to a different result. At first glance, one can say this dress is a mistake, but it's a choice. I knew I didn't have enough fabric to match the stripes and cut on the bias, so I chose the bias. But what we've seen is how sewing a so-called blooper can actually be a deliberate design element. Here's the big sewing lesson, or lessons. Bias uses more fabric. Stripes will shift around curves. Matching them requires cutting pieces separately, but mismatching can be an intentional design. Now, the second dress began with the exact same pattern, but the experience was completely different. In fact, this dress was finished before the striped one. Instead of stripes, I used an all-over print fabric, and this time I had plenty of material. When you are sewing garments that have several joint sections, all-over prints are often a very practical choice. Because the design repeats throughout the fabric, the seams tend to blend into the print rather than standing out. You don't have to worry about matching lines or aligning stripes across multiple pieces. Unless the seam lines themselves are meant to be a design feature, an all-over print can make the construction process much simpler. But with this dress, I decided to experiment again. First, the straps were different. On the striped dress, the straps crossed at the back. On this version, they did not. The fabric was also different. Instead of a woven fabric, this time I used a stable knit, lightweight. That means the fabric has a small amount of stretch. The lining, however, was not a knit. The lining was a woven fabric, simply because that was the material I had available. So now the garment contained two fabrics that behaved differently. The outer fabric wanted to stretch slightly. The lining did not stretch at all. And when those two fabrics were joined together in the bodice, the grain lines began pulling against each other in certain places. The tension showed up at the front armhole and at the back neckline. The fabric began to gape slightly, not dramatically, but enough to notice. And that moment is a perfect reminder that quick sewing projects or pattern hacking don't always unfold exactly as we imagine them. Sometimes the material themselves introduce new challenges, but sewing also allows us to solve those challenges creatively. So to fix the issue and still wear the dress as planned, I did a little more pattern hacking. I designed two small tabs, little loops of fabric, and slid them onto the straps at the front of the bodice. Then I hand-tacked them in place on the wrong side so they would stay fixed. That small adjustment gently drew the fabric inward and eliminated the gaps at both armhole and the back neckline. But the interesting part is what happened next. Because the tabs gathered the fabric slightly at the front strap area, soft gathers formed there. And instead of looking like a repair, the gathers looked like a deliberate design detail. And sometimes the solution becomes part of the design. And in this case, it felt like a small bonus. The lining was heavier than the exterior fabric, and why I decided not to add interfacing to it. I didn't want to disrupt the softness of the outer fabric, but eventually that decision left me with a bit of a tug of war at the armholes and back straps, but nothing that a little loops couldn't fix. Looking at these two dresses side by side, both began with the same pattern. But the fabric, the cutting choices, and the small adjustments along the way led them in different directions. One dress explored the movement of stripes cut on the bias, and the other revealed how different fabric types interact when they are combined. And both reminded me of something I often rediscover while sewing. We might think we have complete control over the fabric, but every now and then, the fabric has its own opinion. And when we listen carefully and adjust creatively, those moments can lead to some very interesting designs. That's one of the quiet adventures of pattern hacking. Sometimes the plan changes, and sometimes the result turns out even better than expected. Share time when you turn the sewing mistake into a design feature in the comments. I love to hear. If you enjoy these quiet studio moments, you'll find more inside my creative home at All My Ways, Andrea. As always, thank you so much for being here.